Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy Juneteenth. Thank you and welcome. I'm Gail Jessup White, Monticello's Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer. I am also the proud descendant of two families that were enslaved here, the Hemmingses and the Hubbards. I'm also a descendant of the man who enslaved them, Thomas Jefferson. I have for more than 7 years occupied the spaces where my ancestors lived and worked, at times feeling their presence and their plea, asking that we remember their labor and their lives. And so we have. Today, as you toured the house that our people built, you experienced Monticello's commitment to telling historical truths, including of the liaison between Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman with whom he had 6 children. But Sally Hemings was not the only person enslaved there. There were the boys who worked in the nailery, the women who worked in the fields, the weavers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and cooks, including my 3 times great-grandfather, Peter Hemings, all laboring from sunup to sundown to give Jefferson the freedom to live a life of his choice, a freedom they were denied. They too must be remembered. Today's event is being held in Mount Alto, Jefferson's high mountain, from whose vistas we can see Monticello, his little mountain, and the University of Virginia, his retirement project. Just this past weekend, Monticello's Getting Word African American Oral History Project celebrated 30 years of collecting stories from the descendants of the more than 600 people Jefferson enslaved. We had a family reunion right here at Mount Alto, where we remembered and celebrated our ancestors and our history. And we also did some mean line dancing. In a few minutes, you will hear from our esteemed panel, including Mayor Sharon Pratt, founding director of the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History, about the paradox of our country's founding and how that complexity continues to affect us almost 250 years later. The IPPH's Founding Fathers series, Unpacking the Complex Truth Behind the Legacy, Where Do We Go From Here, seeks to bring the full history of America forward, as we do here at Monticello. Much appreciation goes to my colleagues who forfeited their holiday to be with us today, and to MFS Investment Management, the corporate sponsor for today's symposium. Thank you very much. MFS is represented today by Abu Tobin, who is the corporate business partner of MFS, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Gail. Good afternoon again. I'm thrilled to be here with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History and all of you to celebrate Juneteenth. This is quite indeed a historic place and time to do this. Just being here in Monticello, I can feel the weight of our decisions and the decisions of our forefathers. Maybe you can feel that weight too. I was personally blown away today. There's a lot I'm thinking about right now. Those decisions had far-reaching and powerful impacts on our past and our present. Most significant decisions do. On this Juneteenth, we can celebrate freedom centuries after a decision was made to take action to end slavery back in 1865. This decision changed our lives forever. That's what I'd like to talk to you about today, the impact of decisions and the way we make them, particularly those that affect not only our lives today, but those of our future generations. At MFS, we're long-term investors. So when it comes to decisions, we take our time. We take a pause, an exhale, if you will, and bring together diverse viewpoints. And most important, we look at decisions from every angle before making them. Now, I know it's not easy these days to pause and reflect before making decisions, especially in a world where everything is moving so fast. Instant gratification is the key. So often we are compelled to react, but it's about playing the longer game and creating the type of progress we all want to see. Think about what's going on in the world today. How often are we reacting to issues rather than facing and stopping the time to reflect and pause? Are we vetting decisions from different angles, or are we just responding? More than ever before, diversity of thought is essential. But it takes time to gather ideas, and it takes time to learn from multiple sources to be able to make the best decisions. What happens when we don't take that pause, that exhale, and combine the diverse views? We miss the opportunity that diversity provides. We react instead of respond. That leads to decisions like schools removing DEI topics from their curriculum. It leads to hundreds of pieces of legislation banning or threatening LGBTQ+ community thoughts, ideas, and information. Consider that as we also celebrate Pride this month. Response is about playing the long game. Response is taking a pause, reflecting, and asking questions, and learning more as we strive to be better. Response is thinking about the right steps to get to the best possible outcome. Response leads to much better decisions. Life moved more slowly when the Founding Fathers made historic decisions in this historic place. Perhaps that pace was a luxury, but we have advantages they don't. We have access to information and easy ways to connect and share ideas with each other. We just need to slow down, consider how long and how far our decisions might reach. Our decisions might not make history, but they do make an impact on our lives. Isn't that worth taking our time for? And so I ask you to pause with me and take your time to absorb the learnings that will occur here today. I'm already, like I said, reflecting on what we just came from, so I'm working on it. But we will discover more about President Jefferson, the Founding Fathers, and the decisions that shaped our country. Today, we may commit ourselves to President Jefferson's words, "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance." So with that, I welcome our panel for our discussion. Thank you.
Guess I'm doing the introduction, all right? Yeah. Well, good evening, good afternoon. You can tell where I am, yeah. It is a real pleasure to be with all of you and to welcome all of you to this historic place. I'm Michael Steele. I am the former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, former Chairman of the Republican National Committee, and currently a political analyst for MSNBC, and it is a particular honor to be here with my good friend and co-anchor and cohort, the Honorable Sharon Pratt, former mayor of the great city where I grew up, Washington, D.C., and her legacy and her leadership has been profound, and currently her idea of creating this institute, this ability to not just talk about history, but to experience it and connect it to politics and connect it to life, which is what IPPH is all about. It's just been a real treat for me to be a part of that idea and
Thank
to
you,
watch
Michael.
you unfold it every day. So it's a real treat to be here in this second in the presidential series that we're doing And this, it has a lot of opportunity for us to get into some good stuff. So I'm really excited about that. I do want to wish everybody a happy Juneteenth. I remember just a few years ago, you would say that to people and they're like, what are you talking about? And there's still some people saying, what are you talking about? But as we saw with Martin Luther King's birthday, the African American community has a way of taking hold of something important and making sure everybody understands its importance. And we don't celebrate for the sake of celebration. We celebrate to understand, to learn, to commemorate. And I think with programs and series like this, you're going to see more and more of our fellow Americans really beginning to appreciate that connection and understanding that history. So this ability, this coming together by IPPH and Monticello is particularly important, and I think we all can really appreciate it. Certainly, just blown away, impressed when I met Gail. I was really looking forward to that, having that particular part of history to touch it, right? Them jeans are working through there, right? Right? When you shake her hand, you're shaking history, folks. And I don't think we appreciate that sometimes. I think we lose sight of that personal connection that we have. So, Gail, thank you for everything you're doing, and certainly to Abu and the folks over at MFS Investment Management. Powerful words, man, and I appreciate that. And it's so important because it really goes to the heart of what we have to do is to open ourselves up, to take in the history, to take in the lessons, to understand where we are and put it all together. So appreciate your words and the support. I also want to turn now to introduce our panelists, who I'm very excited that we have a chance to have a conversation with. Dr. Lisa Francavilla is Senior Managing Editor, for Papers of Thomas Jefferson Retirement Series, International Center for Jefferson Studies. Real warm welcome to you. Nia Bates, Ph.D. candidate, Princeton. I wanted to get it right. Princeton. We got a sister at Princeton. University Department of History and African American Studies. Real pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Dr. John Agosto.
Agosto.
Yeah, I thought.
Rhymes with pasta.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I had it right. Esquire, so he's a lawyer. He can't help himself. Right? He's the interim director, Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. Welcome, Doc. Real pleasure to have you here and have you part of the conversation. So before we get into it, I wanted to share, and before I turn it over to Sharon to really keep, you don't tell a politician to keep your time, right? She just told me take your time. I'm like, all right, settle in. So as one of the things I learned, there were two moments in my inauguration as the first African American elected statewide in Maryland. On the day I was sworn in, I'm standing there on the state step capitol, and Annapolis Harbor is literally right behind us down the hill. And as I'm standing there about to take the oath, it hit me like a ton of bricks that literally behind me, as I'm standing here taking the oath of office, Kunta Kinte was brought here as a slave to Annapolis Harbor. And in that moment, I realized the weight of history and the value of that history and the value of the legacy of constantly moving forward and reaching back and pushing forward, reaching back and connecting that. And the second moment was the next day when I arrived in the office of the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. So on the second floor of the state capitol. And as I walk in, the state's archivist meets me And I'm like, okay, this is different. And he wanted to tell me, he said, I really think it's important for you to appreciate this space. I was like, yeah, okay. He said, you remember, okay, that Maryland was the fledgling country's capital for about 18 months as everybody was migrating towards Philadelphia to write everything out and make it all final and official. Well, during that period, the office of the lieutenant governor, where you're about to enter, was the office of Thomas Jefferson. And he presented me with a book of letters that Thomas Jefferson wrote at the time he was in that office in Maryland. And I was like, wow. I'm working out of Thomas Jefferson's office. And I remember as I sat behind the desk, and so those who know me can immediately know where I went. I was like, okay, so I get to redecorate this place. And I did. I decorated it in a period of Thomas Jefferson. I had the blues and the oh, it was great. But I would walk into that office and I sit behind that desk and I think to myself, wow, Kunta Kinte. Right. And here I am. Thomas Jefferson. And here I am. And I would say to myself, Thomas Jefferson must be thinking to himself, how the hell did a brother wind up in my office? And then it occurred to me, Sally Hemings knows how I got there. And that's the story. That's the story that we have to tell. The pieces that get left out of history. And so that's why we're here now, to share in that story, to bear witness to the legacy that Gail represents and so many others who've been a part of this family in many respects. As Americans across the country are celebrating Juneteenth, we're watching and witnessing the country come together in a way that is at times hopeful, but also problematic and difficult. And so this symposium chose this day, this particular moment, to sort of examine those complexities and to help us appreciate a little bit better what's at stake and why the past is as important as the present in order to inform the future. So we're going to go back to our founding fathers and reflect upon the decisions they made as slavery drove the economy, it drove the culture, and it conflicted the men who owned and operated that enterprise. It was interesting listening on the tour how Thomas Jefferson, as a young man, knew that this is not right, but as an older man realized, well, I'm going to have all this, right? And that's part of the struggle. We're also going to determine how we can utilize the aspirational ideals of Thomas Jefferson. And this series focuses on not just Jefferson, but Madison and George Washington as well. We were at Madison's place a few months ago, on how we kind of move the country forward. So we're all times looking for the pursuit of justice and equality for everyone. And that's what the conversations are about. So I want to turn it over to my friend, the mayor, who has devoted her life to public service in pursuit of justice and equality in her leadership, one that I'm very proud of to have experienced as a native Washingtonian. I remember the broom campaign very well. She's been fearless in promoting that story, and so it's a real pleasure for me to introduce the Honorable Mayor Sharon Pratt, the founder of the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. And we're so honored, I know I am, to have Michael Steele as the co-chair of the Senior Advisory Committee. I mean, you can't do any better than that. It's just spectacular. Of course, Michael knows that I did just seek office talking about the broom. Within short order, most people in D.C. thought that was my form of transportation. But I also want to thank Thomas Jefferson's Monticello for suggesting that we gather for June 19th. That speaks volumes about this organization. So thank you, Gail and Megan and the full team. You know, and I too am delighted to be here with John Agosto and Nia Bates and Lisa Francavilla. And of course, I'm delighted to have our Senior Advisory Committee with us, who Carol Fulp does a spectacular job. Dean April Massey is with us, along with Michael. We have many distinguished scholars here with us, some on the stage, one of whom is the very foundation of the Founding Fathers Legacy Series, and that is Fergus Bordewick. He is a spectacular public historian who is the author of 9 nonfiction works, one of which is Washington, the Making of the American Capital, and that is spectacular. Abu, I want to thank you again. I agree with Michael. Your remarks were absolutely wonderful, and we can't thank you enough. Fergus is here with his better half, Jean Bordewick, who also was very active with the U.S. Capitol Historical Association, I believe. We have also James French, who was our host not terribly long ago, when we were at Montpelier. I also want to acknowledge and do a special shout out to one of our sponsors, the oldest African-American flower shop in all of the United States of America, Rick Lee. We're so proud to have really, it means an awful lot to us. We also have Holly Shulman, who was also a part of our conversation when we were at Montpelier. Of course, Kellogg Foundation, we have the University of the District of Columbia, members of the Board of Trustees. Frederica's here, Representative Rivers, who is the one who keeps them all together, and we appreciate her presence. So we want to get into the heart of the conversation, and the thing that is so terrific, or maybe so appropriate, about having this conversation on Juneteenth is that it's sort of interesting to me that after the horrific event of George Floyd, that the way that the country thought one way to make a gesture was to honor Juneteenth. You know, why did they even think that in the context of this horrific event, that they think of the event of ending slavery, or that finally the folks in Galveston knew that there had been an emancipation? That speaks volumes of why we're doing this Founding Fathers Legacy Series. As Shakespeare says, I'm going to do the reverse of it, we come to praise them, not to bury them. But we have to acknowledge that as brilliant as Madison was, as absolutely what a leader Washington was, I mean, to keep volunteers organized against a Navy. It's hard keeping volunteers organized against an incumbent in politics, much less keeping them organized with no money, no shoes, and actually win that campaign, that war. I mean, that was extraordinary. And of course, there rarely will ever be anybody as brilliant as Thomas Jefferson. My goodness, the very first Secretary of State, the second Vice President, the third President, the author or the architect of the University of Virginia. I just recently found out, even though he didn't believe, I think, in a standing military, he's also the architect of the U.S. Military Academy because he believed in the sciences. One of the great treats of Washington, D.C. is the Library of Congress. I had family that worked there, and I was so thrilled when I finally got to an age where I could go to the Library of Congress. His books were so he had such a diverse and extraordinary collection that becomes the foundation for the Library of Congress. And of course, he is the author of the Declaration of Independence. And as much as we look to the Constitution and elsewhere, or the Federalist Papers, it is the inspiration for America. It is the best expression of who we are. And in our darkest days, Abraham Lincoln, who had to be one of the greatest orators ever, one of the greatest wordsmiths ever, where did he turn when he had to go to Gettysburg to try to keep the country moving and together? He turned to the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's words about us all being equal. I mean, this was a country of life, liberty, the pursuit, something, I mean, only Americans would come up with the pursuit of happiness. You know, right up there, right up there. And because they were so extraordinary, because we were so proud of them, this arrangement around slavery that even in the 2023, what they think of in the midst of George Floyd, let's talk about slavery, had such a profound impact on this country. And what I would like to suggest is that it is because it's beyond what we call isms. We've all, as a woman, I'm often the victim of sexism, you know. People have all kinds of isms, but this was something other than an ism. This was an organized racial hierarchy. It was a caste system where if you were born as a European, you were forever to have access to economic and political power. And if you're something other than European, you're going to have a struggle. But if you're the descendants of people who were African in this country, it'll change a little later, but in this country, you are never to have political and economic power. And the thing about, you see it with Thomas Jefferson in part, because even those offspring of his who had red hair and freckles, he didn't register their names, as far as I know, in the Bible, or what the equivalent of the vital statistics. So it was in the farm book. They were property. And even though he made a promise to Sally, they would be manumitted when they were adults, those red-head, freckled, this racial hierarchy was so intense that they were registered in that farm book. I just cannot emphasize enough that this was a system that didn't end with 1865. It didn't end with emancipation. Enslavement ended, but that hierarchy didn't end. If it had ended when there was a time to make a gesture to the humanity of these individuals, there would have been some type of gesture of reparation. The only people who got reparation were those who had to give up their property, those who had to give up their enslaved people. We know that it continued even into the era of one of the most, speaking of Princeton, Naya, one of the most brilliant presidents, Woodrow Wilson. When he wanted to celebrate great art, what did he do? He had D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. It continued into, as we all know, into the 60s. We didn't begin to penetrate that notion of political empowerment until we had the 65 Voting Rights Act. So we had Obama, we had Michael Steele, and even DC got a right to vote. My point simply is that, as Isabel Wilkerson said, it is with us to this day. That is why I know some people say, why do they go around saying Black Lives Matter? We know when somebody put their knee on someone's neck for 9.5 minutes with everybody around them begging them not to do it, still in America there's a question mark about whether Black Lives Matter. And why do I emphasize it? Because I know anybody in this room cares about it. Anybody who's bothered to come to this and bothered to contribute to this dialogue cares about it. And as we celebrate the greatness of these men, the reason that we want to explore how we move beyond it, because there is pain with it, but there is promise with what they articulated and what they asserted, and they did establish something that is a sort of a hallmark for us all. And that's what we're here to discuss here with the Founding Fathers Legacy Series. We are determined to attain that more perfect union, and that's what this hopefully is about.
Well, all righty then. It says here I'm supposed to say something, but I don't think I really can after that. I will before we get into the meat of it with our panel. I will say this. To take what the mayor has said and move it further into the present to sort of set up what our future looks like. Today I ask a question when I travel around the country. How much do you love America? And do you love it the same if I'm in it? Because that's really the challenge. You know, one of the solutions for those of our founding fathers who at first rationalize the existence and continuation of slavery, then moving away from that was, well, let's just send them back. Let's just send them back. This is ours. And I'm like, well, it really isn't, because there were people here for thousands of years before you showed up. But okay, never mind that point. So the question really does beg itself, you know, when we look at the challenge to this idea of this republic, the democracy that is woven into it, how much do we love the country? How much do we love the idea of America? And do we love it enough that we respect the humanity of everyone on its soil, who also loves the country and also wants to be a part of this experiment? And for me, as someone who's dealt a lot on the political side of things, to watch the devolution of that spirit, to watch the devolution of the humanity of my fellow Americans is very frightening and very frustrating. And I know we can talk about it in strict political terms, Republicans versus Democrats, but I'm at a point where I'm kind of beyond that. I'm really looking at a lot of us. I'm looking at all of us, because at the end of the day, the labels are the labels. And you can hide behind those labels and you can deflect using those labels, but you're not still getting to the core of it, that there's something that's a little bit rotten that we've got to address. And I put it this way: between 2016 and 2020, 8 million more Americans wanted that rot. 8 million more. They wanted that direction we seemingly were headed in. And that's not all one party or another. That's American citizens who've decided that, yeah, I'm really concerned about others. I'm concerned about the fact that I don't have as much or won't get as much. And so all of these narratives kind of feed into this moment right now where we have to take stock and reassess. And that's really what Juneteenth is a call to. It is taking stock and assessing, you know, that moment in history where people just found out, right? Just realized that they've been free for the last 2 years and didn't know it. And in many respects, that's where we are now. We're just finding out a lot about ourselves that we didn't realize, or we just kind of blurred our vision about for a long, long time. We heard it, well, we've elected a black man president, we're post-racial. No, we ain't. Well, Martin Luther King marched and we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. You know, civil rights are secured. Well, ask the Supreme Court that. Because probably in the next week, they will dismantle the rest of affirmative action, as they've already begun to do with voting rights. So these rights that were fought for and secured, the only way they're guaranteed is if we guarantee them. And that's part of the legacy that we see emanating from the lives of the enslaved. They guaranteed our history. I'm sure when freedom came, they could have just en masse said, you know, we're going back. Let's get on a boat and go. This place is crazy. We're not staying here. But they didn't. They actually believed the words that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And we're the living example of that. And so as we get into this discussion, for me, and certainly in light of Abu's words, I want to, that's how I'm kind of looking at this and how I want to learn in this process. What's my responsibility here as a citizen? To be aggrieved and wallow in that, or to help my fellow Americans appreciate this story and this legacy and bring them into this conversation, despite the resistance of some, whether it's CRT or whatever it happens to be, whatever excuse they come up with. How do we help navigate our fellow Americans to a point of understanding and appreciating the history that we're all living? All right? The last thing I asked a friend of mine who was giving me crap because of views I hold, which I'm used to, but that's fine. And I looked at him and I said, answer me this. Why are you so mad that black people are finally telling their side of the story? Why does 1619 Project bother you so much? Why does critical race theory upset your nerves when you can't even tell me what it is? Because I'd asked him, he couldn't. He made up some stuff. I was like, dude, that ain't it. Why are you so mad about my history that I co-wrote along with your ancestors, who, by the way, got here after mine did? So that's our story. That's what we're going to get into, and we're going to do it now. We're going to do it now. So my first goes to Dr. Agosto. You bring in a wealth of connections, lawyer, Ph.D. You're sort of getting into this world of Jefferson, you know it. Help us widen the lens a little bit about your research and analysis and the impact of trying to get the history right. And why is it seemingly so difficult to do that?
Michael, thank you. It's extraordinarily important, and it at multiple levels. I've never understood people who are afraid of history. I mean, I've never understood what it is to be fearful of in that regard. And when I have the opportunity to do tours in Monticello, which I do on occasion, I tell people, I say, look, when we go through the house, we're going to talk about the man we know of as the architect of American democracy. We're also going to talk about the hundreds of enslaved people here at Monticello, including some of his own children, who literally built the house and made possible his lifestyle. that's not two histories. That's one American history. So I don't understand the fear to start with. But I think your question really goes much deeper, and as I'm listening to your comments and Sharon's, I think it goes to, you're talking about Gail and trying to have a personal connection. You're talking about your experience in Thomas Jefferson's office. And it made me think of the first time I was asked to speak publicly about Thomas Jefferson. I had just finished my Ph.D., and it was November of 2008, which will become relevant. And I was speaking here in Charlottesville to a room full of Army brass, and there was more brass than there's a lot of gold braid and buttons on these. And they were having some kind of a leadership conference, and I was asked to speak about Jefferson and leadership. And I have no idea what I said, and I doubt that any of them remember it either. But at the end, someone stood up and said, what do you think Thomas Jefferson would say about Barack Obama being elected president? And it's a question I should have anticipated, but I sat back and I said, his head would explode. I mean, his head would explode. He couldn't comprehend that. But once he came back down off the ceiling and he thought about it for a moment, I think he would understand it in a fundamental sense. In that when Jefferson was elected president, he had campaigned on reducing the military budget. And he was criticized. People said, you're going to make the country weak. And in his first inaugural address, he said, no. He said, you don't understand America. He said, this is the strong, and I'll paraphrase, I can't remember the exact quote. He said, this is the strongest nation on earth. Because when the nation is challenged, every man feeling himself challenged because he's part of the nation, he has a commitment to the nation, he benefits from the nation, will rise to the standard of the law and come to the defense of the nation. And so Barack Obama's election, Sharon mentioned the 65 Voting Rights Act, and for 40 million Americans, suddenly America, the American dream, the American principles are real in a way that perhaps they hadn't been. And I think the same thing is true about history, and something you just said, Michael, about your history.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same thing is true about history, and it's why we have to discuss this history, and it's why it's part of our history. It's not my history. It's not white history. It's our history. And that's powerful, because as long as it's our history, we're all working on this nation together. Mm-hmm. We're all working on that history together. And as you imply, some people find that a challenge.
Yeah.
But when you're challenged by reality, it's your problem, not ours.
They deal with it. Sharon?
Dr. Lisa Francavilla, Jefferson, to some extent, once it was revealed his relationship with Sally Hemings, that is the fixation. But he was a man of many parts. He had many members of his family that meant a great deal to him. He had a complicated family, but could you sort of elaborate on what life was like for him and how he interacted with his family?
Well, sure, I can do that. Well, I know most about Jefferson's retirement period, of course. So that started in March 1809 when Jefferson returned to Monticello. And shortly before that time, his only daughter, Martha, and his son-in-law, Thomas Mann Randolph, were also there with 7 of their 8 surviving children. And over the next few years, Martha would have a few more children, and she also had at least 1 miscarriage that we know about. Additionally, there were members of their extended family that would come to visit, and they would bring their children. And then there were all the visitors. And these were sometimes old friends, sometimes new friends showing up with letters of introduction. They were authors, poets, artists, religious leaders, military leaders, politicians, of course, diplomats, educators. All sorts of people came to see Thomas Jefferson because that's what you did back then. So all of these people in this house, you've seen the house, right? So you've seen that the spaces are wide open, but they're also quite cramped. And you can imagine that when the Randolphs came, Jefferson's daughter and son-in-law, they brought their enslaved people as well, and those people lived and worked at Monticello with the people that were already enslaved on the property. The visitors that came, both the family members and those who were not members of the family, also brought their servants. Some were enslaved, most were enslaved, some were not. So Monticello, the house, was quite literally bursting at the seams with people all the time. And Jefferson was a curious man. We've already talked about his many interests. There wasn't anything that didn't interest him. As he said, there wasn't a blade of grass that didn't interest him. But he believed that curiosity was a great thing. He was a big proponent of continued intellectual and physical activity. And he recommended this for himself, for his friends, and for his grandchildren, all those grandchildren that I just mentioned to you. And so he was really big on lending them books out of his extensive library. He questioned them and followed them on their studies. He discussed various topics with them, but he was a taskmaster for his grandchildren. He also had very high standards of personal development, personal intellectual development, conduct, and his grandchildren were very well aware of these expectations, and they strove diligently to meet his approval all the time. Excuse me. But if you asked them, they would also say that he liked to have fun, that he was a teasing grandfather, but that he was also very affectionate, and that he was also a confidant sometimes. And he would lead them in evening parlor games or on long walks in the orchards where they would pick figs when they started to ripen on the trees. He would challenge them to foot races around the expansive lawn that you all saw earlier today. So we have this image, this kind of pastoral image of Jefferson and his life with his extended family. And that's good to have in your mind, but then to also realize that Jefferson was human, and there were aspects of his personality and his habits that sometimes frustrated or worried his family. So, for example, Jefferson was a bit of a weather optimist. It didn't matter what it looked like outside, it was always going to be perfect for travel, and it almost never was. He liked to kind of force innovations on his family. So one particular one that I remember was a refrigerator, and that was actually what Jefferson called it. And the family hated it because it wasted the ice, melted the butter, and kept the wine warm. And so that was no good. But one of the things that was most worrying to all of the family when he started to get older was his stubborn refusal to stop riding on horseback over his farms by himself. And even when he almost drowned after having a fall from a horse, it still didn't stop him. So this is, you can have a little bit of an image of what Monticello was like with the family and all the people that lived there and Jefferson's own activities. But we have to remember that it was not only Jefferson and his white Randolph family that lived there. There were enslaved laborers who were working in the gardens and in the orchards and in the shops in Mulberry Row while the children were running their foot races. There were enslaved women who helped Martha give birth to all those children and who took care of those children afterwards. There were enslaved young boys and men who were taking care of the horses and carriages on those long rides to Poplar Forest or into town in torrential rainstorms and blazing sun. So I spend a lot of time in my role as the editor of the Jefferson papers, but I'm not just reading the letters. I'm reading what's there, but I'm also looking for what's not there. And there's a lot of the story that's going on that's hidden in the letters. The family's letters tell us things about Jefferson, about life at Monticello, that Jefferson never wrote about himself. But even then, there are still the gaps that you fill in once you get to know about all of the people that were living at Monticello and not just Jefferson's family. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. Now, you speak very clearly about the sort of codependent, interdependent relationship. We've gotten a little bit about the family dynamics, the immediate family, Jefferson, his daughters, wives, kids, grandkids. Talk to us a little bit about that interdependent, codependent nature of the slave owner and the slave here at Monticello, or a place like Monticello.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we have this warped sense of what life on the plantation would have looked like. Of course, our lens is through The Lost Cause, it's through Gone with the Wind, it's through all the Disneyfication of history, and it's not rooted in the reality of what life was like for most people here on this plantation. These people lived very interconnected, interwoven lives. Everything about their experiences were connected. Jefferson's earliest memory, for example, is being raised onto a horse by an enslaved person for a family trip when he was very, very young. And his last memory would have been of Burl Colbert adjusting his pillow shortly before he died, the only person in the room who could understand that Jefferson was trying to say he was uncomfortable. And so everything about this man's life is touched by the experience of slavery. And so when I talk about the interconnected lives that are here on this plantation, I'm also talking about the ideas, right? Jefferson is a man who is writing profusely about freedom, about democracy, about what it means to be America. He's designing buildings and spreading his architecture about, hoping to set a national style. He's telling other slaveholders how to take care of their plantations, how to manage their enslaved populations, right? And all of that is happening against a backdrop of the men and women and children who were enslaved here at Monticello. That those people, like Israel Gillette, would have known more acutely than maybe anyone in the world where the shortcomings were in Jefferson's ideas of freedom, right? Israel Gillette talks about a visit from the Marquis de Lafayette, in Jefferson's early retirement, right? The Marquis de Lafayette comes here from France, and he asks Jefferson very pointedly, what are you going to do about slavery? Why haven't you freed all these people? And Jefferson deflects. He says, the next generation will figure it out, right? But Israel Gillette Jefferson is sitting on that carriage that day. And can you imagine what it felt like for a very young enslaved person to hear their owner, someone who is praised for their ideas of freedom, say, yeah, they should be free, but I'm not going to do it, right? Somebody else will fix it later. Somebody else is going to hold America accountable for the ways that we, the founding fathers, have fallen short of our vision of freedom. And so the interconnectedness comes from these bound ideas of slavery and freedom. And I think the descendant community, through their oral histories, through the ways that they've reclaimed their stories, through the information we've recovered that isn't in the family letters or the farm book or other written sources, tell us that these descendants and the enslaved people who were here had their own ideas about freedom, and they fought ardently to make those things happen. So every point in American history where we have expanded upon Jefferson's ideas, descendants are not far away from that moment, whether it's the suffragettes using the language of the Declaration to fight for women to vote, whether it's civil rights activists fighting for all kinds of civil and human rights, right? Descendants are part of that as well. And so it's very interconnected, and it continues to be something we're trying to unravel.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask Michael, as a follow-up to what you just said, Nia Bates, that to what extent is there a resonance to her observation of the interconnectedness that existed on the plantation of Jefferson's time and to America today? Is there a resonance? Is there a relevance?
I think there is. The interdependent nature of those relationships are defined by the parties, right? They kind of look at each other and, okay, I figured out my role, you figured out your role, and we kind of know how we're going to roll, right? How we're going to do this. And even within that interdependent nature, you have gradations, right? So the relationship is very different between the African Americans who worked closest to Jefferson and his family than those who didn't, who were out in the fields or who were in some other part of this vast plantation who had very little contact, but they were still connected to the family and to the slave owner through the institution itself. And I think we see a lot of that play out today. In fact, it's funny, just in the last 24 hours, in a couple of appearances on MSNBC, it was asked the question, a follow-up on the idea that Sarah Palin was asked, is this a cult with Trump? And she went on and said, of course not, and then defined what a cult was, which is exactly what they're in. But the point was the idea of this interdependence that all those individuals have, one to the other, around a concept, an idea, an individual, a system, no matter how far removed they may be from it. You know, Alaska's a long way from Maryland, right? But those in the MAGA universe in Maryland are connected to those in the MAGA universe in Alaska by those threads that sort of bind them ideologically, politically, et cetera. And we see this narrative playing itself out. The left, the progressive left, has the same sort of systems that exist with them. We saw that initially with the Occupy Wall Street movement. I saw it firsthand with the Republican sort of grassroots, constitutional-based kind of emergence back in 2009. So you have people sort of latching on and identifying in the community that they're in to sort of give them meaning, give them purpose. And so to that young footman who's on that coach, listening to Jefferson and Lafayette and talk about him, essentially, he's now connected to that storyline in a different way as the next generation. And I think that's one of the challenges, Sharon, that we're going to see play out in this country as we move into this political cycle, is how the next generation, which is already starting to emerge, if you paid any attention to the Gen X and Gen Z crowd, it's a whole different level of politics. And how they reconnect, reestablish those linkages, in some cases breaking those old narratives around political silos and my relationship to the government and the role of government and things like that, are going to be no different in one sense than those generations immediately after Thomas Jefferson's death, who had to deal with how do we break the hold on this thing, and it led to a war. It ultimately led to a civil war. And there are those today who argue we're on that path again, in many respects. Maybe not the way the last one played out, but it will play itself out in different forms and in different ways, and it's something that we have to be aware of. And it kind of, for me, turns to you about this relationship that you just talked about with the families, and how when you listen to what Naya was talking about, this sort of interdependent nature of it, of the plantation life, and the idea of invisibility inside the household. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how even being invisible, a lot of these slaves tried to find the power to kind of power through and create something different for themselves, even though they were living in this oppressive situation.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's degrees of invisibility in this situation, and one of I'm just going to talk about a couple of the most striking ones for me. So there are several household account books that the family kept. So Martha's daughter, Jefferson's daughter Martha, and then Martha's own daughters would keep this household account book. And they often required a lot more food than they were actually raising themselves at not themselves, but the enslaved people were raising at Monticello, so they had to rely on the food that the enslaved people were raising themselves in those few hours of time that they could eke out for themselves every week. So these household account books list purchases from enslaved people for chickens, for produce, things of that nature, so that food is ending up on the table at Monticello that's feeding these visitors and the family that's coming to stay at the house. But even more importantly, those people are named in this household account book, but there are other people that aren't named. And I say this because you can't buy 20 chickens from a woman one day, and then 2 days later buy 20 more chickens from her, and then 2 days later buy 20 more chickens from her. So these household account books suggest to me that there's a larger network of exchange that's going on to the quarter farms, and that these people that are recorded in these household account books are acting as liaisons. They're brokers, so that people who don't have first access to the people with cash at the house can still get the benefit of having some of that cash for themselves. And so they're all lifting each other up that way, even though the people in the house, Martha and her daughters who are buying these produce and these chickens, even a beehive, don't know where their money's going. All they know is that the food is coming to the table. So those people further down on the quarter farms are the ones that are invisible to us, but they have to be there, right? The other thing, of course, is we know, and you probably heard when you were on tour today, that Jefferson died in a great deal of debt. Well, this wasn't a sudden realization once he was gone. He knew this was happening. He knew it was coming, and he knew for years that it was coming, and he put it off as long as he could. He was a great optimist. He kept thinking the next harvest is going to pay all my bills. The next harvest is going to pay all my bills, or I'm going to be able to sell land or whatever, and it never worked that way. Oh. Wow.
Well, now. It was a bear. It was a big one, too.
That's okay.
Right. So for those who don't, because this is live stream, so for all you folks going, what the hell just happened? Everybody jumped up and they moved. There was a big black bear participating in our conversation just outside the glass enclosure here. Yeah. And then in true bear form, as soon as we all stood up, it just like, okay, this is crazy, and jumped off. So we'll return now to our regularly scheduled programming. and we'll back to you.
Oh, I mean, the subject is interesting enough that we've drawn the wildlife in, so that's great, right? So anyway, so I was mentioning the household account books and the invisible people that are hiding in that narrative. But there's also the debt that Jefferson was in, and as he was starting to realize that there was going to be ways that he was going to have to deal with this debt, the closer he got to the end of his life. And one of the things he says, he comes up with this idea. It comes to him in a dream, he says, and he describes it to his family, and that is that he's going to sell property by lottery. And we know he had this idea and that it came to him this way because he tells his daughter about it and he tells other family members about it. But who else is probably in the room hearing them discuss this dream about a lottery? And what does that mean to me, as a person standing over here waiting for somebody to ask me for water or send me on an errand, but I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, this is not good, right? So those people are invisible because we know they're there and they're hearing the family discussions. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's oldest grandson, comes to him later and says, "Grandpapa, you're going to have to sell Monticello too. It's not going to work just selling other property. You're going to have to sell the house here." And that means to Jefferson, well, that means my family, meaning Martha and all her children, won't have a place to live. But everybody else that's present, all of the enslaved people who are, again, waiting to be sent on an errand, fetching and carrying, doing the various things they're supposed to be doing with their time, they're also hearing this. And they must have been thinking, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my wife, for my children? There's no way out for us. And then this discussion continues after Jefferson's death. And the family, his white family, are sitting in the home at Monticello, and they're talking about planning the next or the first auction, rather, in January of 1827. Jefferson's been gone for a few weeks, a few months, but they're working on ways to dispose of Jefferson's property in the ways that will gain them the most money to pay off his debts. And that means they're talking about what's the best way to dispose of his human property. And all of these people are not invisible, but they are in the discussions that are going on. But they're very clearly there. So that's what I mean about invisibility. These people are so present all the time. And when you look at these details that are coming out in the documents, you have to see them. You have to think about them and think about what it was like to be them. I don't know about you guys, but I would be feeling incredible panic and trying to salvage my family and trying to figure out how I was going to do, if I could do that. And I just, you have to look at them that way.
No, absolutely. Nia Bates, you have done a lot of research and work around the Descendants Committee at Monticello. I think also the University of Virginia, the communities there as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about Sally Hemings' family? And it's still very complicated. I mean, all of these families coexisting. It's beyond coexisting with being enslaved people and being the enslavers. You've got a woman who's living with your father, the father. All of these dynamics. Can you sort of elaborate give us a sense of that?
Yeah, so the enslaved families here are deeply interconnected, right? The Hemings, of course, are one of the largest families here at Monticello, over 80 members of the Hemings family here. So when we talk about Sally Hemings and her life, we're talking about a person who is someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's aunt, that there are so many different connections, and that the Hemings are, in large part, working very closely with Jefferson and his family, right? They're living and working on the mountaintop. But other members of the extended Hemings family are in many other roles around the plantation, right? They are the cooks, they are nursemaids, they are carpenters, they are people who Jefferson trusts to put in a lot of the major skilled trades that are happening here at Monticello. And so for Sally Hemings' children, I mean, even if we remove the subject of their paternity, they are related to the Randolphs. They're related to Jefferson's children through Sally Hemings' father, right, who's John Wales, who's Martha Jefferson's father as well. Sally Hemings and Jefferson's wife are half-sisters. So even in the absence of a conversation about paternity, they were already family. I think there's an added layer of thinking about how much compartmentalization Jefferson must have done in his own mind to have children with his wife's sister-in-law, who was an enslaved person,
and
right?
Complained about race mixing.
Yeah, and right, and to also then write in his only book, right, that Black people are inferior, they're incapable of love, they don't have these kind of relationships within their own community, according to Jefferson. So for him to then have at least 4 children with Sally Hemings, and we believe she was pregnant at least 6 times, maybe more, that says a lot, right? And so dealing with the descendant community, we acknowledge that there's a range of feelings that people will have about this history, right? Some descendants have dealt with their own emotional responses to the conversation by investing in believing that this was a romantic relationship. Other members of the descendant community, of course, also feel that there was potentially rape involved, right? Either way, there's a gross imbalance of power in the position that Sally Hemings occupied on this plantation and the one that Jefferson occupied. And so working with the descendant community, we have navigated all of those conversations. And I think I've learned that the descendants are much more articulate about it than any scholar ever will be, right? This is your own family history, right? All of you have families. You know how complicated and how spicy your conversations can be with your own family. But imagine being in a position, as Monticello is, to interpret a family history to the public, one that involves potentially the exploitation of a young enslaved woman. So there's that element. Another element of the story, though, is that the Hemings, because they are such a large and well-documented family, have occupied much of the narrative attention that we give to enslaved communities here on tour. But that is not to downplay the fact that there are at least 30 other families living and working here, right? And so the work with the Getting Word Project and the oral histories that we've collected have enabled us to reclaim some of those items that have been silenced or overlooked or left out of the written archive. So through descendants, we've been able to learn that Israel Gillette took the surname Jefferson in freedom. We learned that Isaac Granger, who was a blacksmith enslaved at Monticello, whose cabin I hope you saw today on a tour, also took the surname Jefferson in freedom, mainly because the person who was writing his free register said, you know what, you were enslaved at Monticello. Wouldn't that be cute? You want the name Jefferson? And he was like, okay. You know, if I have to get free today, then we can put this name on the paper, right? So, you know, there are all these different layers to the way that people choose to identify and remember their connections to this place. And so I'm hopeful after spending all weekend with the descendant community that we continue to be a place that not only sheds light on the vast experiences of people who either labored in the fields, whose names are not recorded in the written record, and also those people whose lives we know a good deal about because of the farm book and other sources. I hope we remain a place that just reconnects them at all sorts of levels. I mean, part of the beauty of the Getting Word Project, and I think all descendant work, whether that's at Montpelier or at the University of Virginia, is the opportunity to reconnect families and communities that were forcefully separated by dispersal sales and other separations through the institution of slavery. And so I think there's a real beauty in the work, but I think it also asks a lot of questions, right? If you're going to work with descendant communities, what do they get from it, right? If you're going to benefit from telling these stories as an institution, then how do you give back to the descendant community? And I think Monticello is leading in setting the tone for having conversations about reparations. Monticello established the Promise Grant program that is a scholarship for descendants, which is a step forward, right? But I think as a nation, we have a long way to go in conversations about repair and what we do with descendant communities.
Well, that's excellent, Naya. Of course. I know James French knows that takes great pride in what they're doing at Montpelier as well now too, with the Descendants Committee. But Dr. Agosto, how do we reconcile this contradiction of Thomas Jefferson? Now, he's emblematic of what happened in America. It's just that he was so extraordinary and so important to who we are in America. It is such a struggle to reconcile how he is emblematic of the best of who we are and then the worst of who we are. Can you help us?
Sure. No, Sharon, it's such an important question because Jefferson is this iconic image of America, and yet this is the man who enslaves his own children. He enslaved 600 individuals. Those of you who are at the house today, when you come down, you see Jefferson's tombstone, and he says, by these things I wish it to be remembered that I had lived. Now, of course, he's not going to mention slavery as something he wishes to he says, I wish it to be remembered the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for establishing religious freedom, and the University of Virginia. Political freedom, religious freedom, public education. America's mission statement, America's creed, America's promise. He is speaking in an American voice about what it is that we think of as the American principles, why it is that millions of people still come and want to come. And yet there's that contradiction. And we think about this a lot. I mean, if you work here, this is an omnipresent issue. And so I think Americans need to think about this. They need to answer this question. I can give you my answer. I think the critical element for me is to recognize that the founders failed. Okay, they failed. They failed at political freedom, most obviously with slavery, women's rights, Native American rights. They failed at religious freedom. We had religious tests for office in this country until 1961. And they failed at public education. We don't have taxpayer-funded public education in Virginia until the 1870s. But, and Nia mentioned the women at Seneca Falls, but the principles are more important than the failures, which is why the women at Seneca Falls are quoting Thomas Jefferson. It's why Frederick Douglass is quoting Thomas Jefferson before the Civil War. It's why Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers are quoting Thomas Jefferson. It's why over 100 nations in their own declarations of independence, their own constitutions, are quoting Thomas Jefferson. Not because of the failures. Now, we can't forget the failures. That's part of the history. But because the principles are so critical and so fundamental. You know, I tell people that we're told this country's divided. Michael made an allusion to that. And I guess in some respects that's true. But you're not going to find many Americans who disagree that at the foundation of this country are political freedom, religious freedom, and public education. At the foundation of this country are the principles that Jefferson's articulating. I got news. We fail. We're still struggling with voting rights. We're still struggling with who gets to vote and where and how. We're still struggling with religious freedom. Look at the Supreme Court cases this term. We're still struggling with public education. But you know, you work at it. Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. I always tell people it doesn't meet justice, it bends toward justice. We try to do better. That's the idea of enlightenment and progress. So, you know, I think there are people that benefit from telling us that we're divided. I think the media sometimes benefits from that. I think there's politicians who think they benefit from that. We've been told the lie that the government is our enemy. It's us. You know, it's us. And I think that Americans, by and large, share those Jeffersonian principles. So I don't want to ignore his failures. I don't want to forget them because I think you learn from failures. But, you know, I do think there is a broad embrace. And I think Juneteenth, you know, Juneteenth is not, and I hope I don't get in trouble. Juneteenth is not an African-American holiday. It's an American holiday. Because it's part of that struggle. It's part of it's great success for the African Americans. It's great success for us, for America, because you know we're making progress on that. So you know, as I said, I don't want to forget the failures, but I tend to still embrace those principles.
Well, that's encouraging.
It's I really appreciate that that last point. And to wrap up this portion, because we do want to open it up for a few questions from the audience before we conclude. On this portion, Mayor, I'd like to turn to you for a thought on this institutional effort, that our institutions, which are the founding building blocks, if you will, are there for a reason, and to further this idea of individual rights, liberties, pursuit of happiness. How do we, or how do you see, given the challenge that these institutions are facing today, how do you see us reaffirming those values through these institutions? We see the assault on the DOJ, right? So now, everybody wants to defund the FBI and all this other stuff that we see. We see the assault on the educational institutions, people screaming at school board meetings who just found out that there were school board meetings, right? I've been in that room with enough to know that one very well. How do these institutions survive this moment, particularly given that we can't even really honestly acknowledge the institutions that have played a role in creating this moment from slavery onward?
Well, I guess I'm like John Agosto. I'm optimistic. Always have been. I guess that's an American quality I have. That, in spite of the disappointments of America, and I think it's very hard, especially for those of us we know women, Latin Americans, indigenous Americans have been treated so horrifically. Those of us who were a part of that particular caste system know that we're still very much a marginalized community. But we believe in America. We believe in those principles. We have faith in what the founding fathers articulated. It gives us confidence to move forward. In the toughest of times, what do we articulate? As John said, we reiterate what they said. We reference what they said. We believe in it. And that's why some of us are impatient with those who were born to so much privilege, who go to places like Helsinki and disrespect this country. That is so upsetting to us, because we believe in America. We have believed in America when America has not believed in us. And so I do believe, and therefore have confidence that we are going to get through these tough times, that I think there are more Americans who want it, that the aspirational aspects of us are much more a part of who we are, even though we will have these difficult forces. So, and I do want to remind everybody that one of the reasons that we are here celebrating these three particular founding fathers is because these three particular founding fathers brought us to the point of Washington, D.C. They established that capital along the banks of the Potomac, and we in D.C. are still hopeful that we'll have a full participation in the
we're working on that. We're working on that.
But I'm very optimistic, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your help today in celebrating the life of Thomas Jefferson and the promise of America. It was really, really uplifting. And Gail, and on to your team, we really appreciate it so very much.
Thank you very much. So we're going to do a little Q&A of our esteemed panel here, and so there's a microphone in the back. If you have a question, please go to the back. Now, here's the rule, all right? I just want to hear your name and your question. No speech, no extemporaneous thoughts, no telling us about your childhood.
I mean, like the Academy Award.
Woo! Oh, I struck a nerve. Y'all want to get up and talk about your childhood now.
It depends on how interesting their childhood was.
It depends on, now, if you had an interesting childhood, you may want to share a few. But I want, in the time we have left, I do want to get in as many questions as we can, because we do have a wonderful meal and opportunity planned, so I don't want to get us too off schedule. So name, question, and then to whom you address the question. So yes, ma'am, you're up.
Good afternoon. My name is Sylvia Cyrus. I am the Executive Director of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the founders of Black History. And my life started, no.
Y'all better settle in. It's going to be a good one.
I guess the question that I have is to any of the panelists, what can we do to support history and the truth in its interpretation on a wider scale in America? We know that STEM has done so much to take all the oxygen out the room. Too many of our children don't know civics. These things are deliberately being removed from the curricula. What can we do?
That is
want to-
excellent.
I'm happy to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to get in trouble again. One of the critical elements, I think, is just support public education. And by that, I mean public taxpayer-funded education, which does not include private school vouchers, does not include charter schools, does not include private schools, because public education is the opportunity where we come together as a nation and talk about our civics. So I'm a huge supporter of public. I believe in public education is a real opportunity to address some of these problems.
And I would just add on to that. Support the teachers
And the
because they want to talk about this. They want to teach these subjects. They're being told not to touch these subjects. So support the teachers in these public schools, because if we all support the teachers and their ability to teach these subjects, to engage with their students when the students have questions, so that they can develop these teachable moments that they're always talking about, the more of us that support the teachers that do that, the harder the pushback against these people who tell us not to is going to be.
I cut you off.
Join a silent. Yeah, Dr. Cyrus can't say it, but I will. Join ASALA. Support all of your local public history organizations, whether that's your local historical society or the African American Heritage Center or any number of small Black-led preservation groups. And I say Black-led. Please support the Black-led organizations too, right? Put your money where your mouth is. Our organizations struggle. We have some of the oldest museum institutions in the country, and yet our spaces still are understaffed. There aren't enough resources to go around. We don't have enough people doing oral histories. So please do those things too.
And I would just say, Mr. Steele,
Yes.
speaking to your point, pay attention to what's happening in the state of Florida and Texas and other states. Don't just sit back and not think that it impacts you. It's coming to a state near you, and I think that we all should be watching.
Oh, yeah. It'll be there before you know it if it's not already there. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is James French. I won't tell you my life story. It is pretty interesting. This is really for everyone, but I think I want to ask you, Michael. We heard some really great comments from all the panelists. I'm thinking about the conversation that Naya was talking about with Israel Gillette. Is that the correct pronunciation? Yes. And Jefferson about, what about us? What about our rights? And then John Agosto earlier talking about that the founders failed, but the principles didn't fail. They're mistakes, but the principles are what are still valuable to us. So what can we do? From your perspective, you're very close to the political world, and I'm wondering what role, how do we leverage or take advantage of institutions like Monticello and others, I'll say Montpelier too.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
To help people understand the principles that those stories along the walkways here between Jefferson and Israel Gillette speak to. How can this enter the public realm? How can this produce tangible results? And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question very much. It is, for me in a lot of respects, the evolution, the modern day evolution. By modern day, I'm looking at a period of 2006 forward. All right, in that context, watching what was happening inside my own political party, the Republican Party, and thinking to myself, well, this ain't right. And this is not the direction. This is not part of the founding. This is not what Lincoln and Frederick Douglass often talked about. And you begin to realize the importance of the concern that our founders had about factions, what they call political parties back in the day. They didn't want them. They thought that they would harm this idea that they were trying to create, all right? And I got that. But what I got even more to your question is the answer for me rests in the founding documents. It rests in what the founders did that they probably didn't realize they were doing. That they weren't just giving power to white gentry, landed owners, people who held estates like this, white men. That however, for whatever reason, they wrote that document that empowered everyone in this room, that empowered all the citizens in this country. And they charged us in a way that I think we've forgotten, and that is the words that say, we the people. Not me, Tommy Jeff, and Georgie Wash, right? We the people, in order to form not a perfect union, right? It goes to what you were saying, but not a perfect union, not the best union, a more perfect, meaning we're going to constantly strive towards this thing, that this idea that we've created. And I think in large measure, we have given up on that. We elect people and then we could go back on, okay, we're done, right? And then we get all upset and we start moaning and groaning when stuff don't go right. And then you retrench and you find a tribe and you start throwing stuff and yelling and screaming. And you lost sight of the fact that our Constitution, a Bill of Rights, these documents charge us with the responsibility of making this thing work. Ben Franklin wasn't wrong when he was asked, what have you done? Well, we've given you a republic if you can keep it. He didn't say, well, the boys and I, we're going to work this thing out, you'll be okay. He said, we're giving you something that you now have to take responsibility for. And we don't. We don't. And we need to. When you look at the lack of participation in voting, now everybody's all upset about, voting rights going away. Well, what made you think that battle ended? Just because they passed the Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act? No, we had a Constitution and we're still fighting for that. Second Amendment rights, all right? That fight has been going on from the very beginning. So why do we think that once these documents are written that we're just now free of our responsibility as citizens, that we the people no longer have any business in this? And so that to me is how we begin to address all of this, how we pay attention, why we need to pay attention, what we're paying attention to, and how we hold each other accountable. You don't get to tell me that January 6th was legitimate political discourse and don't think I'm not going to get up in your face. But they get away with that because they know that no one will. Because we the people are like, well, maybe it was. I don't know what they mean by that. Well, you know what they mean. And we know what's happening. So I think for me, I'd like to see us civically involve ourselves in a way that not only do we outwardly express the role we have as citizens, we the people, but that we also then fundamentally take control of those institutions, going back to that point about the institutions, so that we're now teaching the next generation of what that role and that responsibility is.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll do a couple more, and then we got.
How do we make room for the next generation and impress upon the people that we like for people to work past their retirement age? That's, I don't have a problem with that. You can come as a consultant or an advisor. But how do we get beyond this party politics where it's your turn to go, it's your turn this month, it's sort of like a understanding that we can nod that no one wants to leave office. And
So let me just real quick answer that. No one wants to leave office? How do people leave office? You vote their behind out. That's how they leave office. Well, but that's the point. That really speaks to the problem I have, is that we don't recognize the power we have. Yeah. We think because we've elected them, they get to stay as long as they want to. No, they don't. And I say that as a former elected official, right? No. My ambition was not to be lieutenant governor for life. My ambition was not to then use that to be the next thing. And that, people say, I've been in Washington for 45 years. Well, that's 40 years too long. I mean, think about where the founders were. They came to Washington. They wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as they could because they had to come back and farm and continue their lives and work. But now we've so elevated these individuals. They're not working for you. Please, they're not working for you anymore. So the power is in your hand. We the people, it is ultimately it. These institutions are there for us. We own them. This process, we own it. We own all of this. We own the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And so we've got to take responsibility for that and acknowledge that the players who aren't working with us to create affordable health care and better schools and all those things that we used to have these big political debates about, if they're not doing the job, vote them out. Yes, ma'am. Real quick.
My name is Colleen Mary Yates II, and we are resilient people. If I could ask all of the slave descendants from Monticello to please stand, and as the second, all slave descendants who are in the room, even if you're not from Monticello, please stand.
All of us.
Y'all realize the whole room should have been standing, right? I just don't want that to get lost. She said, if you are a descendant of slaves, y'all.
Yeah. Good
Yes,
afternoon. I am Rahul Amin Kwander, and I'm representing the League of the Descendants of the Mount Vernon enslaved. And I'm here as one of those people. But mine is not a question, it's a comment. I want to remind everybody that this forum, the significance of this forum is to go out to the highways and the byways and to spread and to teach and to share. Because what we are doing here, part 2 of 3, in terms of where we go from here and the complexity of the legacy of slavery engendered by the Founding Fathers and others, is something that other universities, other organizations, Asala among them, are doing and have a responsibility. But that responsibility does not end when we leave here or when we leave Mount Vernon next month. We must go out. Our nation is on the eve. This is not Christmas Eve. It's 250th anniversary Eve. So we want to help engender new thinking. We talk about the new Negro right after the World War II that led up to the Renaissance. We need to engender as best everywhere, every occasion, to get other people to open their minds and hearts, because this is how we're going to offset the adversities that are coming to us when people try to nail us and make critical thinking and wokeness adverse. We all know that what critical thinking means. We all know what woke was supposed to mean. So we have a responsibility to not let them turn that against us. So I just wanted to just throw that out to the group today. Thank you.
No,
Thank you, Ro.
And the point shouldn't be missed. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this great nation. Are we going to tell our story along with the rest of the stories that are being told? And that's going to be an important conversation. So I want to thank our panel so much for your time. Dr. John Agosto, Nia Bates, Ph.D. candidate. I'm going to pray, doctor. We're gonna pray Dr. Bates on her. So, Ph.D. candidate, Dr. Bates.
Thank you.
And of course, Dr. Lisa Francavilla. Thank you. And now, I'll turn it back to the mayor.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gail. I know you want everybody to be on the alert that we want to go outside, but we can't because we don't know where the black bear is. That bear is really large, and it could harm you. So
yeah, I'm glad you're having a good time because we want you to stay a little bit longer. Okay? We'll let you know when it's we have security there on top of it, but we have space upstairs. You can spend the night. Thank you for a wonderful program, by the way.
dinner is served now. James.
Se você disser que eu desafio